In these next videos, we're going to be talking about adding the database into version control. In Drupal, there's a lot of information in the database. All of our users, all of our content, all of our configuration, like our content types and fields and views, all of that reside inside of the database. And so even though we've learned how to version control the code base, which is very important, we still have a whole lot that can go wrong on our site. So for example, if a piece of our configuration breaks, like a view, without version control, it's going to be very hard to figure out what happened exactly. And configuration like views are very complex, so it's not like it's a simple task to go in and simply fix it. But when we're talking about just the database in general, for any project that requires a database, there's a few good reasons to be version controlling it. So first of all, it creates backups. Now, most of the time, you'll have a different system for creating backups of the database on a regular basis outside of version control, and we'll talk about what parts of the database should normally be pulled into version control in order to make the backups most efficient. Secondly, having different versions of a database inside of version control allows us to compare different versions. So if something's going wrong or we're trying to track down something, we can look at the differences between a certain version of the database to be able to narrow down what might be the problem. Now, we've done this before in code by using the diff command. And finally, if we keep the entire database inside of version control, then that helps us with development because we have a version of the database that's associated with a version of the code. And so we'll know that that version of the database and that version of the code are in sync. This is particularly important in Drupal because, for example, if we have a module in code, we still don't know whether that module is enabled and what the configuration has been for that module when it comes to creating a development environment or updating it from one version to another. Now, for the purposes of version control, there's a few different types of data inside of the database. The first is the schema, and the schema is the structure of tables inside of the database. So if you open up phpMyAdmin or your favorite database browser, you'll see that there's a list of tables, and each table has a list of columns, and each column has a set of properties. This whole collection of tables, columns, and properties constitutes the schema. And the schema is a common aspect of the database to add to version control because it's typically small, and it's easy to identify changes from one version to another. Secondly, we have exportable configuration. What I mean by exportable is that the configuration that's in the database can be exported into code, and that code can then be added to version control. Now, we'll be going over a module called features pretty soon, and through features, we'll not only be able to export a number of configuration components inside of the database into code, but we'll also be able to do nice version control type things like roll back particular changes or update the database based on changes in code that maybe somebody else on our team has made. And a lot of the most important configuration inside of Drupal can be exported this way. Through features, we can export content types, we can export fields, menus and menu items or vocabularies, and with some additional modules like StrongArm, we can export variables, which include tons of configuration on the site. We can export views, and we can export boxes, which is a souped-up version of the block module in Drupal. But sometimes we have configuration that's not exportable, or we are using a piece of content as a type of configuration. And we'll talk about how to add these to version control in a bit. And finally, we have content, like nodes, users, taxonomy terms. All of these items are typically ones that you'll want to keep out of version control, simply because over time the amount of data becomes too great. Really quick, let's go ahead and talk about how these different types of data inside of the database are managed in version control. I already mentioned a couple of solutions. So first of all, for the schema, which again is the tables, we simply use a command line tool called MySQL dump, and you can also use a visual tool like phpMyAdmin in order to export all of the tables and the structure of each column inside of those tables. And for exportable configuration, we're going to use the features module that I just talked a bit about. For non-exportable configuration, we're going to talk about using a tool called Selenium IDE, which we've talked about in some of our other video collections, but we're going to use it in this case in order to record macros for browsing through your Drupal site and copying those into code so that other people can replay those macros on their own development site or on a production site, for example. And finally, for content, right now there's not a stable solution, but in the future, the UUID and UUID features integration modules are going to give you the ability to export specific users, specific nodes, and specific terms, among other content on the site, into code, just like you can any type of configuration. For now though, what you can do is use Selenium IDE for any of those components that you need to port from one site to another.